Hello, everyone. Welcome to Unearthed, a panel with the SUPERCOLLIDER team. And I am Kaitlin Bryson, representing the Art Sci Center, the UCLA Art Sci Center. And Richelle, it's my honor to introduce Richelle Gribble. Richelle, do you want to say a few more things about SUPERCOLLIDER?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. So we are representing SUPERCOLLIDER, which is an artist-run gallery and curation platform based in Los Angeles. And we do a series of exhibitions in our mothership headquarters, as well as satellite shows, both in the United States, but also abroad. And all of our curations are really exploring science, art, and technology, how they're intersecting, colliding, and collaborating. And so in our panel discussion today, we're featuring our Sci-Art ambassadors. And each of our ambassadors have worked to create an outdoor art exhibition that's featuring a lot of different works, and then also integrating some digital virtual projects into the displays as well. And then we have three other members that aren't on this panel discussion that also included artworks in our video reel that we will show at the beginning.
Great. Well, let's get to that video right away so we can talk about the work after that.
Sounds good.
Horseshoe crab blood is light, milky blue. Legend has it, the color comes from their fantastic oceanic retention systems. So yes, if you grow them in omega-3 fortified canola oil, their blood can be mistaken for urine. What do you smell? Not the patent you sold to your scientist neighbor on the genetic sequencing of your weak gum tissue, or the memory of being microchipped by your helicopter parents when you were a tot. But sometimes if you really focus and inhale, you can bump around some bacteria nearby as it enters your nostril. Its membrane opens up, releasing what appears to be a worm. This worm isn't just any parasitic worm, but really the key holder to the Level 2 Egg Lab, the office where you can become a cyborg yourself, with the help of several $1,000s and a silicone-shaped eye socket with an organic plastic eyeball. Instantly, your nasal cells possess a mere craving for artificial meat. The kind that sometimes you think is real when you see a blush pink terrazzo coaster, glossy plastic railing, which really resembles the kosher wiener you had at the Rangers game last summer. Put the starter in a 1-foot deep cardboard box and wait a few weeks. The garden eels will pop open from the kelp pods and anchor their knees into the chicken bones. Excreting a mucus as they grow, this will enhance their watermelon seeds to crack open and release in your very own kitchen the horseshoe crab itself. The banana peels release enough potassium to trigger the copper enzyme within the horseshoe crab. That coagulates when foreign bacteria is present. Given the exotic environment that is a domestic space, this 450 billion-year-old creature will begin to coat your interior a milky, baby blue.
All right. Well, thank you all for watching that screening. I was just going to read a little blurb about this exhibition and our choices for the curation. So selected works in the exhibition examine the possibilities of unearthing. Artworks will be planted in various gardens and outdoor sites, including UCLA's Mildred and Mathias Botanical Garden. These naturalistic scenes will be presented alongside 3D scanned works and virtual environments, culminating as a video art piece. Planting these artworks in actual and stimulated natural settings, this exhibition stimulates terra firma in relation to untethered virtual spaces to examine the relationship of site specificity to non-specific geographies bred from new technologies. So together as artists, today we'll kind of dive deeper into looking at those structures, both virtual and physical, that humans have constructed to keep themselves alive on this planet. And so, yeah, thanks again. Kaitlin, do you want to start us off with our first question for these artists?
Yeah, I would love to. I also just want to say I've watched that video a number of times, and each time it's been like a good movie. Like I keep finding more things out about it that I like. Yeah, really, really profound and really sort of like leaving me with a lot of questions that we get to ask you now. So let's see here. Which one should we start with? I guess kind of starting off with the idea of bringing work out into the environment and kind of on this whole like nature culture divide that I hope that we all are kind of going to break down in this conversation. But I'll broadcast this question and whoever wants to talk about it first, we can start there. But how does the work change by its relationship to the environment and more or less the act of decentralizing? So decentralizing work from an indoor space to the outdoor space, and how has that changed? How does the work change?
I can jump in. I think it's a really interesting question. I think to think about this whole exhibition as decentralized in many ways. I think at top of mind for a lot of us right now is that whole idea of dismantling systems of oppression. And in a very subtle way, I think even the act of taking the work outside of the gallery and for us to all come together and collaborate in this remote way, at least for me, was in line of that way of thinking about these times right now. I think also more specifically for my work, which was like the little beehive sculpture that traveled to a couple different locations and then was also in a virtual space, that really allowed me to question my own methods of movement and how I move across a landscape or through a space or how I transcend borders. So I often travel a lot for my work, typically on the back end for research and for collecting materials and information, and sort of the coloniality of that effort is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. And I think being able to take the work outside of the gallery and then also implicate myself in the documentation of the work in multiple spaces allowed me to think about myself as a traveler in a new way and ask some questions about what that means and what the journey of an artist can mean and how one could approach that. Yeah, I'll end there and let someone else talk.
Well, I'll speak. My project is the Chris Burden's avocado, and it's basically a plant that I've been nurturing. And he has an appearance here since my green screen didn't work. But in any case, only more recently, I've taken the plant to different locations and sort of started building up its resume and taking it on a very basic level, taking it to UCLA last Sunday in 100 plus, 115 degree heat was very, very difficult on my plant. And so it's sort of, now I have to work extra hard to nurture my plant. But each time I've changed its environment, it's taken somewhat of a beating. And then I always panic because this is an ongoing project. But really the truth is that if the plant suffers, that's just part of the project. Though I don't want him to suffer, but.
And your project, Molly, too, from its origins is through this like exchange, this pass off of Chris Burden's actual avocado that you've taken fostered and grown on this journey. And so even that idea of decentralization from the very beginning has been so important to your story.
That is a good point. Yeah. It was given, the seed was given to me, or the pit, and then I nurtured it. And its gestation sort of coincides with my daughter's life. So they're the same age. But that might be a departure from the original question. In any case, somebody else can speak to it.
Hi.
Oh, yeah. Go Sharon. Sorry, no.
Sorry, I didn't see us both volunteering at the same time. My piece was the fire season piece, which is unfortunately all too relevant at the moment. And I originally thought of bringing artwork to the garden, and I love that garden. I've been going there for years, but it didn't feel genuine. None of my work felt like it belonged there. So I guess I took the idea of a site-specific piece away from the site by working at my computer at home, which is where I've spent 90% of my time since this quarantine. And I usually I'm a graphic designer, so I'm at my computer all the time, and I usually like to have a real separation between my studio work and my artwork. And this is maybe one of the first times where I've sat at my computer to make an artwork. And it felt somewhat wrong to be recreating this artificial fire when there are fires raging outside, but it's also always on my mind about how there really is no fire season anymore. And each year the fires kind of encroach closer and closer into our urban settings. So I guess, yeah, it was a new experience for me to make a site-specific work virtually, I guess. And I also, that was my first time seeing our collective video, and it just was really struck me like how we're all on the same page. Yeah.
Very nice. And I know, so another component that many of you have explored is this idea of decentralization relative to artist in residence programs. And I know, Britt, you have your background of the Arctic Circle residency, and I know that's where your video was shot. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think a big part of my practice, like so many of us in this group, is involves engaging with sites all across the world. For me, like traveling to that particular site was something that I feel like really solidified this notion of the landscape changing for me. I think it's really easy for us to see this in terms of headline and news, but like being faced with a glacier kind of breaking apart in front of me was something very different and very moving. The piece with the dog is an ongoing video series that I've been doing long before GoPro ever came out. So I've been working on this series since 2008, before GoPro was a thing, where I was outfitting different dogs in different environments with spy equipment. And for me, it was really interesting to be in a landscape that's completely foreign to me, in this sense that I had just gotten there, but this dog had a very connected relationship to this place as a guide dog. And looking at the landscape and that ground from the dog's perspective became a really kind of important element for thinking about how to make work and understand work in that location, and really thinking about it from a different species perspective. What does it look like when the ice and snow are no longer there from the dog's point of view? What is that like for the dog? We can really only kind of like hypothesize that, but thinking about what this means for other species, whether that's something that's domestic that we're attached to like a dog, or, you know, in a current wildfire season where we know that there are animals kind of seeking different shelter, like what is that like? That's something that I'm really interested in thinking about in a lot of my work.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because that idea of having like the animal interaction by you while you're working is also super interesting to see. When I was laying out my 3D printed insect charts, I was in the pollinator garden at the UCLA Botanical Garden, and there were these bees kind of buzzing around me. And then I'm placing this thing which is documenting, you know, their lost lives, but also in plastic, which is this material that transcends us and will outlive us. So that collision, I think, starts to happen when you take your art outside and you take it beyond to see it forms this new meaning just in its interactions. And that kind of ties into our next question, which you started to tap into. But how is your practice shaped by other species, the more than human world? How does the process of making artwork facilitate and foster kinship with other species? And I know, Emma, yeah, you had some close encounters while you were installing, if you want to share.
I was just about to offer myself up to talk a little bit. Before I say something on this question, I wanted to say that before starting this, and I talked a little bit with you guys about what you were going to do for this project, but not so extensively. And seeing this video, it's become really clear that all of us are really interested in elements and systems inside the environment. And it's really inspiring to see that. And for example, Ellie's work where it's frozen and then it actually comes, it melts and then it comes back. And so this idea of interglacial periods and this idea that the environment has been in fact changing for millions of years before we came here. And it just happens to be right now that we're in a moment where it's preferential for us. And so when it's not preferential for us, all of a sudden we're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And it's absolutely exacerbated by our actions. And so doing this and seeing the whole video being put together, thank you so much, Isabel, for this beautiful video. It's really highlighting that fact that this earth is absolutely shared with other species, and that even though it's been preferable for us in these past couple thousand years, it won't always be. And it's almost a comforting fact. And being able to take the artwork, this colony piece that was originally on a woven tapestry that was made out of plastic fishing rope, to take those individual separate tiles and reconfigure them into an environment and take them outside of a gallery was really inspiring. And as Richelle mentioned, I did have close encounters. I stepped into the creek, squished around with my feet in the muddy water, and there were little bees flying around everywhere. And so it was, I know, it's very brave, right? To be like, oh, I'm gonna, just put my feet here and step around where the bees are flying. But I kept a safe distance and I worked around them. And so the actual installation was following their path and following the movement of the water. And it changes the way that you think about creating art, because all of a sudden you realize, am I creating art for humans, or can art be equally shared with other species? And then you really start to think about, wait, who is the audience for here? Do you think that a bee will fly up to this piece and land on it and think just as much as a person would stumble upon this piece? Like, oh, that's a pleasant surprise that this is here. And so this interaction with the environment is nothing new to human beings. And I think it's very inspiring. And I would absolutely think about this more as I create work, and think about the fact that other species can be collaborators. They can actually change the work of art. And I think that's what's really inspiring about this show.
I think I will go next, talking about that. And yeah, of course, responding to all the work that we all presented together. I was also very happy to see all this very beautiful work and ideas. Talking about interspecies relationship, I think there is a topic that I usually go and try to explore in my work. In this case, for this piece, remediation, it was coming from this idea of how, well, and it's building up, I think, from other projects as well, in which I try to really think and put myself in this very unknown place of how to deal and how to really get into the worlds of some of the other, in this case plants, or in the past microorganisms. So I was thinking when we were when there was this call for this piece of Unearthed, what the meaning of that, I was like really wanting to understand what that meant. And yeah, I found that there's two definitions that I think they're very related with our work in general, and in my case as well, in my own perspective. So I found that Unearthed means to find something in the ground by digging, discover something hidden. This I think it's an attitude that I want to always address in my work, like this attitude of living open to discoveries, to surprises, to find in the small, the unimportant or the imperceptible, even the little worms that are living in the soil, those patterns that are connecting us with the rest of the living organisms or non-living things. So those patterns are comprising the systems in which we live. And yeah, some of the times, and we can do it by ourselves, putting ourselves in those environments, but also, like in this case, talking about technology, also help us go a little bit farther in terms of how can we see things with magnified eyes, telescopic views, and even in other wavelengths. So this is kind of one of the definitions that I was taking from unearthing something. But at the same time, there was another definition that came to my mind when I was doing this research about exhuming. And this brings me to this other path that probably we as humanity also take ourselves. And it's, meaning humans being related with soil, and also being related with human, which sometimes exhumes ourselves. And I think that's when we forget our connection to the soil and our connection with what sustains us. So I think they're both these definitions that I was reflecting. And yeah, I tried within my practice to really put us back to earth and to really engage with this as a way to understand our part of the whole system that we live. So yeah, that was my reflection.
Maru, I love that you bring up uncovering what's hidden. I think that in everyone's piece, there's an element of that, whether it's like showing the way that water flows that we don't typically notice, or a micro world, or the how a dog sees the Arctic. There are all these different ways I think our pieces are highlighting or flipping a perspective or a vantage point. And I think a lot about the capacity within collaborating with more than human species is a new way of sense making almost. I think there's so much, especially in terms of climate, that happens before it's visible to the human eye, or happens in a way that sight cannot detect. And that's one thing that has been inspiring for me about everyone's work too, is seeing how we can key into these other species, or try to consider for a moment things from their perspective, and what new things will that show us about what is happening in the world. I think as we've seen with the fires in California, just as one example, in recent years, so often our attention is captured by what is highly visible and sensationalized. And so much, I think, of what all of our work explores are these really nuanced, hard to detect shifts and changes in ecologies and environments that if we paid a little more attention, perhaps we'd be connected to earlier. But I think that's something I wanted to bring up as well, this possibility of shifting maybe away from the dominant forms of sense making and questioning or interrogating what some of those other less dominant forms, but equally as illuminating forms of sense making can be, and what that leads us to understand about the shifts happening in our world.
Also on that note, in just the shift in understanding time, like when you form a relationship with a more than human entity, or place a camera on a dog or on a cockroach. Right? Brittany, you had cockroach tracking systems. Some like that just shifts our understanding of time, because we see or we understand time in you know, in terms of our perception, but as the rapidity of climate change is happening, and as like these, I mean, everything is unfolding around us, like we're unraveling time so much faster. And to begin to sort of perceive that shift in another way that's like really outside of our mode of perception, I think is really powerful. And to use technology, as Maru was talking about, and to use modalities of making as a sort of catalyst for understanding that, I think is really powerful.
And just to piggyback off of that, I just love this notion where artists can show and tell what others might not see. And just, you know, seeing that as our responsibility to kind of, you know, be able to amplify and showcase those places and voices that are otherwise not heard. And that shift in perspective is so required to be able to have this more systems view of tackling ecological changes happening in the world. And so as artists, if we can continue to like channel these different perspectives in our projects, I think that that's gonna enable us to have a more holistic vision of how to work together and how to unify these different systems. So yeah, I really love that idea of the micro gaze and how you can kind of go unearth some things. And it's incredible. As soon as you zoom up close, there's a whole nother world that you might as well miss if you don't get up close. Fascinating. Brilliant. Well, maybe, yeah, does anyone else have any other remarks in terms of looking at the other species and how to channel their views?
We have a question from the audience on YouTube, and one question from a 5-year-old who is amazed at Maru's work and wants to know, what were the pieces by Maru made from?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I created the piece of remediation, and this is a time lapse. You saw it. It was a second video of like a circle, and there was a time lapse of plants that were doing remediation, and it's plants how they are like from sprouting to developing, trying to absorb a contaminant in their own bodies. So that was it. So thank you so much for asking.
Are there any other questions from the audience, Kaitlin?
Oh, I'm muted, sorry. Classic Zoom mute. There's not any other questions, just a lot of excitement.
Awesome, awesome. Well, we started to touch onto this, but we noticed that within some of your works, there's this thematic consistency with the climate crisis and environmental degradation. How do you use your art as a tool to address these issues? It's a vast question. It's a big one.
It's also a heavily like sort of responsible question, which I think is another question within that question, but maybe let's start with the first one.
I think one way I like to think about engagement with like this thematic idea of a climate crisis that we're existing within is thinking about just ways of making that more tangible. Again, like going back to this idea of like a media sensation, the way that we kind of, I mean, I think a lot of us are in California, so we experience some of these things firsthand, but I think there's also a media disconnect often in terms of like tangibly what that feels like to be in a place like that. And so for me, finding systems that are relatable, there was a piece that was in the video that we all watched that was like a scan of a log that's mine, where these beetles have made this path underneath a piece of bark, and those beetles are, you know, destroying our trees and forests at a kind of unimaginable rate as a pest. But if there's a way, for example, using those and linking those to thinking about like a highway system, like how am I like this pest? For me, coming up with kind of tangible metaphors between us and another species is a way to kind of make sense or understand our complicit nature in this crisis and in these systems that we're kind of aiding in this degradation is one way that I like to think about my own work in relation to that.
I think you bring up a really good point in terms of kind of zooming in and making the climate crisis, which is just so vast, very tangible. And I think that might be the disconnect for so many people to rally behind it, is that it seems too large to control. And what's your role within it? How do you participate and you know, alleviate some of these issues that are happening? And so I think what I've really loved with seeing your artworks all coming together is you're making it personal, you're making it local. And I think that moment kind of reinvigorates just the preciousness of nature and hopefully inspires other people to really notice the pattern on the leaf and to really look at the water droplet, you know, underneath the blossoming flower. It's igniting that awareness and that presence, because if you don't have that, how are you going to be able to really advocate for something and really know what's being lost if you don't really learn to see it as it is and explore it and find love and wonder in it. And all of you really do approach your arts practice in that same way, which I really love. Yeah.
I'd love to add a comment to that. Sorry, there's motorcycles outside. I'd love to add a comment to that, talking about things that are unseen or unheard of, and the fact that when you go to media, we were talking about this a little bit before we started this panel discussion. When you go and you look at the news, a lot of it is false news, or a lot of it is underreported, like what's really going on with the climate crisis. And I think something that's really important that I've been thinking about a lot with my art, because I look a lot at aquatic ecosystems. I think a lot about the ocean and the ways that we're connected to the ocean in every single thing that we do every day. Every package we get delivered on our doorstep has traveled and traversed across oceans. Our toothpaste has algae in it, every little thing. And I think Sasha also touched upon this a bit with her work in the fish. And so there's so many different connections that can be made, but we're disconnected in large societies from it. And so reawakening that connection, and also learning trying to find people to tell stories about their experiences in environments, because not everybody is going to have experiences diving underwater in the kelp forest, for example. And so a lot of people are going to miss out on the opportunity to see this change, even though it's a negative change right now with ocean acidification and warming waters. People are not going to know what they've lost until after it's gone. And I think that is something that I think about a lot, and it makes me sad, but it also makes me hopeful that we can reach out to people who should be telling stories, reach out to people and kind of act as a cultural mediator, like, hey, like these people really need to be heard. These scientists have data that needs to be seen and understood, and this can affect our daily habits and the way that we relate to the world and the oceanic world. And so I think it really matters who asks questions, and it matters who tells these stories. And so I think as artists, we can kind of pinpoint these conversations and create this dialogue together.
Yeah, this question is a huge one for me. But I think all of you have brought up like really important things. So my brain is kind of like working on overdrive right now, but I think a lot about, the bringing the personal narrative into some of these conversations. I, for a long time, have thought about how can I use an art practice and its emotional capacity to, one, bring people onto this information or different ways of understanding the environment through an emotional avenue rather than a political one. I think art allows us to do so many things that the media can't do alone, that science can't do alone. But when we bring viewers or those who experience our work into another context, that some of this information can land hopefully in a way that allows them to digest it on a personal level and then understand it outside of the context of politics. Oh, and there's my more than human species barking at someone at the door. Another thing I think a lot about is how the media, I think, desensitizes us to stories of disaster. I've been looking in particular at the way that climate crisis is portrayed in the media recently, especially the California wildfires, and how sensationalized the disaster is. And then after a certain point, when it's not exciting anymore, those stories leave the media, and we are left to not think about adaptation, to not think about the rebuilding process. And so we focus so much on the height of the crisis and then sensationalization of that when that's gone, it kind of leaves the cultural memory in a certain sense. So I think one thing I'm really interested in doing in my practice is finding a way for us to think about the adaptation that happens after a crisis and use my artistic practice as a future making tool. Arturo Escobar writes a lot about this movement towards sustainment and how in order to create change, we have to enact those changes in our own small ways in our own world. So I think a lot about, not only in my practice of creating installations and multimedia works, which I do, but these types of conversations and all of the work we do at SUPERCOLLIDER as a community, as a way of enacting and hopefully producing futures that integrate climate crisis into our conversations the way we all do. So yeah, it's a huge question. And I think the other thing that I'm constantly astounded by, and which makes me feel also so grateful to be part of a community of artists who all have different interests in terms of the climate crisis, is that there are millions of stories and issues and levels to kind of tap into. And it can feel quite overwhelming as one artist to be like, how do I talk about everything? So also to know that there's this community here and everyone sort of interested in tackling that issue in a different way and with a different lens and with a different specificity. I think those are all things on my mind. And Manuka has a lot of thoughts too. I don't know if y'all caught any of those.
That was a multi-species answer. But I couldn't agree more. And, you know, so much a part of our SUPERCOLLIDER motto is that out of sight, out of mind can no longer be our driving force. And as artists, I think we really can bring things in sight and in mind, especially, you know, as Emma's addressing these oceanic environments where from above the waterline, you can't tell that there's a crisis happening underwater. And it's really, you know, being able to actually dive deep underwater and see these coral reefs and see these views that only few people are able to go and experience, and bring that back to so many more people, that really has so much power in awaking just this understanding of what's unearthed, what's underwater, what's underground, what's all around us. And if we can keep undigging that beauty and that wonder, there's a lot of motivation, I think, that can come from that, to be motivated and tackle these challenges.
I just want to add a last thing. I'm sorry if I'm talking too much. I was trying to respond a little bit about what Isabel mentioned of action. I think that, we do have the power, and we make awareness, and we present the problems, and we participate in the conversation, but we are also people that are able to modify culture to go beyond the culture divide, the culture-nature divide that we've mentioned, but also to act. And I really appreciate when artists have the capacity to go beyond just, for example, the exhibition space, and just go up to the communities and go and do work that could inspire actual change. And that's something that brings me a lot of inspiration in the case of really doing the work and allowing people to not just feel overwhelmed by all these very terrible situations, but and sometimes I've mentioned in past projects, like believing in ourselves as organisms capable for remediation, like we are ourselves capable, or as Donna Howard mentions, responsible, like with the ability to respond. And I think it's coming from our practices, the possibility to really embrace our capacity for doing something. And yeah, that's something I really believe that art can help.
We have about 5 minutes left, so I want to just kind of open the floor for any questions. Panelists, Richelle, I think we actually have, that we don't have any other questions in the chat. I'm not seeing. But yeah, do any of you have any last bits you want to add?
Can I pose a question?
Yes, please.
I think that, you know, this 2020 has been quite an experience for many of us. And I'm just genuinely curious because I know it's caused me to sort of shift through my practice a lot and really question it and think about what I'm interested in doing as we move forward. And so I'm really genuinely interested to hear how you all are, like, what's next for everyone, sort of, or what's your thinking about what's going to be important in the near future and really long term in your own practices.
I'll speak. I have a young child, and just taking it day by day. I honestly am shocked that I was able to produce anything creative this year. And I'm really grateful for this group. And then another group I'm involved in, museum adjacent, to keep me thinking beyond just my little quarantine housing unit, because it's really so overwhelming, everything that's going on right now in the outside world. So I don't necessarily have any artistic plans for the future at this moment, but I'm really grateful for these groups that are kind of keeping me thinking about things beyond just surviving one day at a time.
I mean, it is difficult to project into the future, clearly. But I think over the past few months, just for me, accepting virtual spaces has been kind of mind-blowing, actually, because I'm realizing how virtual space is an equalizing space, and it's accessible to everybody. Well, not everybody, but many, many, many people, more so perhaps than the more traditional gallery structure. And I am kind of blown away at how many, or just at how work translates to something totally different online. I don't know. I think like I'm sort of interested in exploring that more. It's not something I really considered before the pandemic. But I think it's viable space that I hadn't fully considered, that I hope to explore, that we'll all have to explore in the coming who knows how long. Anyway.
And Molly just led a really ambitious showcase that was a drive-by art show as well. So bringing more art outside and being able to experience it in different ways. So it's been amazing to watch as you brought Made in LA to life here in LA. And that brought out quite a few people from their quarantine shelters to come see it.
Yeah, and just to sort of echo what Sharon was saying, like once I was involved in the project, I became really motivated and inspired. And then to have, you know, sort of collective energy was really powerful. And yeah, I mean, people are still using outdoor spaces just as much as virtual spaces. I mean, the show Made in LA is a survey show throughout Los Angeles. And it really was about half online and half in real life. And Isabel has something next week in real life. But yeah, I mean, I have to say, like, these moments of working with others and being focused on a project are very helpful for sanity. I don't know
Yeah.
if anyone else does.
I just want to add that it's like we are these species, we are a species making adaptations within the realms that we're given or the circumstances that we're given. And I think that that's another thing to constantly sort of remind ourselves of and like reorient through that back to the nature culture divide that we are a part of these systems that are changing and fluctuating. And as artists, Emma brought up something fairly grim at the beginning of our conversation today, well before, but just this question of like, is art going to be, or as artists we have this responsibility and that sort of question rolling around, but then also like as the climate continues to change and these potentially with what circumstances we might be presented with, like what happens to art in those places, and will there still be a place for art, because it might be just more about survival. But I think that there will be always a place for art, I guess, like even from this conversation and just like the relationships that we're all forming in this moment and the adaptations that we're making as artists. I think that those things will always be present and remain consistent. And I also think that art can really enact policy change. That's another thing that from these sort of creating these cultures and creating these movements that really kind of like spawn these ideas that kind of permeate into other realms, and affecting policy is one of those things. And that's one of the most inspiring facets that I see within this group, and a lot of other artists that I'm around are kind of like, we're moving into this world where we want to really affect change. So we are being the activists and the activators of that change through the work itself. So if there's any more things to add, we have a few more. We don't have anything after this, so we can say a couple more things if anyone has anything else to add.
I'll add a little bit on that grim thought of like what happens to art after this. And I feel like thinking about what Isabel was saying too, like how is your art changing during the pandemic and now the fires, like these are all very real things that are happening and definitely part of the climate crisis. And I think it's something to consider, like, is art, I feel like art is moving more and more towards activism, and now art is kind of, it's like we have to think quickly about materiality, like what materials are we using, and is this affecting the environment even more? How can we use materials that are sustainable, and how can our art practice be a model for how people should act sustainably in culturally in this nature? And so how can art inspire cultural change? And so it almost seems like art is turning more and more towards activism. And I feel like with more and more pressure from climate crisis, I think art is going to transform in a way that none of us know is coming. I feel like something cool is going to come with art.
I like the optimism. Thank you.
Me too. I think we all kind of need that right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I really do think that as we keep going at it, seeing these virtual shows emerging, seeing these drive-by shows emerge, I mean, it's just proof that artists are pretty inherently resilient, and nature is also very resilient. So you put those two together, and I think that we'll just find a way to keep pushing through and inspiring other people to keep going even when things are difficult. And so often through these restraints and through these parameters, that's actually where creativity really can burst at the seams. And I think that this pressure just keeps kind of closing in on us from a global to local level. And I think that our response to that is just starting, really. And there's so much that I think is going to be born from this, like Emma's saying, that we couldn't have ever expected. And from SUPERCOLLIDER's end, we've done so many different virtual shows, and I wonder, had lockdown and this not happened, I don't know if we would have accelerated so quickly to this other form of making and 3D scanning our sculptures to upload and make that virtual. So it's really igniting a new way of creating art. And that to me is really a potential of showing the power of resilience and what can come from that.
I think briefly also, many of us are teachers or parents, and it's important to just sort of be thinking constructively and moving forward and not sort of getting stuck in the sludge of media, etc. Because, I mean, we need to sort of foster some sense of optimism.
Well, speaking of virtual shows, Richelle, do you want to talk about the virtual shows that SUPERCOLLIDER has up right now? We can send people around.
Sure thing. Well, we have several happening right now. The first is actually curated by Isabel and created by Isabel. It's called Artificial Ecologies, and I believe that's also part of the Ars Electronica lineup. So that's a really beautiful 3D modeled gallery experience, also attainable through VR. That's all built online. And then we have Feminology of Hope, which features about 40 artists, and that's also a VR gallery space. All this is accessible through our website. If you want to visit supercolliderart.com, you can take a closer look. And then we actually just brought our first physical show to our brick and mortar, the Mothership HQ, and the show was co-curated with Maru and another curator, Naomi Stewart. And it's a beautiful show exploring system of emergence from a social level to a cellular level. And that is open by appointment for visitors wearing masks. And again, we're continuing our programming. We find it's important to continue to be in dialogue with each other and also the arts community and beyond here in LA. And it's helping us make this challenging time brighter, more colorful, more collaborative, and it definitely is making 2020 kind of go by a little faster. But we've got a busy lineup, so definitely stay in the loop with what we're doing, and we're always happy to find other collaborators, spaces, and makers to bring into our circle so these creative collaborations can take place.
Sure. Thank you so much, Richelle. We also, Art Sci Center has a show that's opening on, sorry about that, that's opening online that that Ellie Joteva made along with Zeynep Abes in our collective that also, and Ellie's also in the SUPERCOLLIDER team. And that show is up just now, and I'll also post that in the chat. So if you guys want to, you can take a look, and that will also be on our website at telluricvibrations.com. Thank you all so much for this wonderful conversation and for being here today, sharing your work and your perspectives. We really appreciate your time and definitely appreciate your artwork. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good Sunday.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.